I've titled the speech, Modern Labor, What Would John Curtin Think? In recent years, we've become increasingly conscious of the need to preserve and make accessible the heritage of our Prime Ministers, although we're still behind the United States in the attention that they give to their leaders. There are now several Prime Ministerial libraries, including the Hawke Prime Ministerial Library and the Whitlam Institute's Prime Ministerial Collection. The John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library at the Curtin University is an important centre for scholarship and for making the new generations aware of a leader that many, if not most historians, would put among Australia's greatest Prime Ministers. But in getting the feel of a leader, there is something special in being able to look at where they lived, not just walking in their shoes along the corridors of old Parliament House, but in their slippers, as it were, in their very own home. And so it's been great that the Curtin House at Cottesloe is being preserved for the nation, and I'm delighted to be able to stay there for a couple of nights. I was able to put the finishing touches on these remarks in the Curtin dining room this morning, where, and I quote, "In the evenings, the dining table would become a desk for the children's homework and a place where Elsie Curtin read all of the newspapers and cut out items of political interest, often until midnight." I want tonight to look at some of the challenges facing Labor after what have been a difficult few years, and in many ways a quite extraordinary period in Australian federal politics. But I'd like to begin by speculating about what John Curtin might think of contemporary Labor and how modern politics is conducted. Let's imagine him, a traveller in time, walking along the Cottesloe beach, as he loved to do, musing with some of Labor's current generation, and I'm sure you two would be among them. The conversation would surely first turn to a dramatic and very obvious difference between his parliamentary Labor Party and today's. Look at the old black and white photos of the caucus of the 1930s, and there is not a female face. Curtin might point out, however, that it was during his prime ministership and from his home state that the first woman caucus member came, and that, of course, was Dorothy Tangney, who was elected as senator in 1943, the same year as Eden Lyons entered the lower house on the Conservative side of politics. But would he be surprised that Australia had had a woman Prime Minister? Can't answer that question, but he probably wouldn't have been surprised that the nation's first female Prime Minister came from the Labor side. In the discussion, today's Laborites would be full of the tales of trouble and strife of recent times, the debilitating 3 years after the coup against Kevin Rudd. Well, he might point out, you should put that into some perspective. In 1931, before the disastrous election in which he temporarily lost his seat at Fremantle, Labor split for the second time in less than a generation, with Joe Lyons ratting and going on to lead the Conservative forces, and while on the other side of the party, the forces of Jack Lang fractured the party. During his years as opposition leader, Curtin, as he tried to get the federal party together into a united fighting force which was ready for government after a terrible period of the Depression, had a constant battle with the followers of the big fella. When the talk on the Cottesloe beach turned to the nightmare of the 2010-13 hung Parliament, Curtin would remind his modern listeners that he had trodden that rocky path first, after two independents crossed the floor in 1941 and brought him to the Prime Ministership. He might be too tactful to recall that following that hung Parliament, Labor won an election, and with a thumping majority rather than lost one. He would be familiar with the problem of a low primary vote. Labor polled 33.4% in the recent election. In the 1934 election, the one before Curtin gained the leadership, the ALP polled 26.8% of the national vote, with Lang Labor polling another 14.4%. Curtin would remind his modern friends how he rebuilt the vote. The ALP primary vote in the next three elections was 43.2% in 1937, 40.2% in 1940, and 50% in 1943. But they would say it's harder these days. People are less rusted on to the two main blocks of politics, Labor and the Conservatives, and more inclined to register a protest vote. They'd tell him about Clive Palmer and the power he will have in the Senate. And that would prompt a few questions from Curtin about the Senate voting system, because of course proportional representation came after his time. Curtin would be surprised by Labor's experiment, now ended under Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, of the leader selecting the front bench. In his day, caucus was more powerful and more independent than under either Rudd or Gillard. It is hard to see the 1930s caucus tolerating such a change of Labor tradition and culture. And of course, in the end, even Kevin Rudd, who'd seized that power, recognised that it wasn't a very effective way to go, and it has been since restored to the parliamentary party. Curtin would be surprised too at the loss of clout of Labor's extra-parliamentary organisation, which has happened progressively since the 1980s. Steering his marquee issue, the introduction of partial conscription, through the party was for him a major enterprise, compared with, say, the cakewalk that Julia Gillard had when she sought to get a tick from the 2011 National Conference for selling uranium to India. As he contemplated Labor's modern national conference, Curtin might wonder at how it had become such a mass stage-managed event, so very different from the small but powerful gatherings that he regularly attended. He might marvel that trade unions still retain great power in Labor, and wonder how this could be so, given the plummet in the proportion of Australians who are union members. Only 18% of Australian workers are in unions, and only 13% of those in the private sector. But Mark Latham, undoubtedly among those on the beach, would point out that unions still have 50% representation at state conferences, and he'd direct Curtin to his book called Not Dead Yet, in which he writes, and I quote, "Union power is now exercised through centralised control, union secretaries donating money and staff to marginal seats, and rounding up the numbers at state and federal Labor conferences." Perhaps Curtin would raise an eyebrow at how many MPs who get into Parliament through union affiliation have never actually been blue-collar workers, rather different to his day, but are instead university-educated men and women who have often served as political staffers. Curtin was all too familiar with Labor power groupings, but he would need a mud map to get round the organised factions and sub-factions of the modern Labor Party. Similarly, he could tell plenty of tales of troublemakers and backstabbing, but he would wonder mightily, I think, at the Gillard-Rudd story of disloyalty and mutual destruction. He'd contrast the loyal support, political and personal, often extended in the middle of the night when he was depressed at the lodge, that he received from Ben Chifley, his political partner and treasurer in his government, though not actually his deputy PM. Still, an agoniser by nature, he'd be thankful he didn't have to live by the fortnightly opinion polls that fed so powerfully into the leadership instability during recent years. Looking out at the other parties, Curtin would easily recognise the Liberal Party and the Nationals, despite the name changes. He was familiar with the Conservatives as the United Australia Party. The Liberal Party was, in fact, formed the year he died, and, of course, the Country Party. But he'd ask his modern Labor friends, whatever did happen to the Communist Party? And who are those people who are now on your left? Who are these Greens? Curtin, with his plain style, would be uncomfortable with the celebrity aspects of the modern Prime Ministership. Even if Australia had had TV in those days, one can't quite see Annabel Crabb getting into that Curtin kitchen. Nor can one see Curtin, who apparently was very fond of roast lamb, whipping up some dish for her. A former journalist, Curtin had good relationships with the Canberra hacks, but he'd wonder at the intrusiveness of the modern media. At the same time, he'd also note that his new Labor friends were quite reticent when it came to sharing confidences and secrets with journalists on any serious matters. When he was PM, he gave twice daily briefings to journalists at his Parliament House office, and much information in those briefings was very, very confidential information of what was happening in the war and troop movements and so on, which was not actually directed to being published immediately, but was passed on to proprietors. And Curtin trusted those journalists, and almost always, I think, the trust was respected. But he might be uncomfortable with the media dogging his every step, and startled both by the need and the capacity for a Prime Minister these days to be constantly in touch. In a speech last week, the former head of the Productivity Commission, Gary Banks, talking about the intensity of modern media pressure, contrasted Curtin's situation. Banks had been at the Niagara Cafe in Gundagai and seen a plaque in honour of a visit there by Curtin, which was dated 1944. Banks noted, and I quote, "In the depths of war, Australia's Prime Minister would have been driving to the national capital on important business and chose to stop, like my family, for a cup of tea. Wartime Gundagai would have been a media-free zone." And continuing quoting, "If our Prime Minister had tripped and fallen on the way out of the Niagara, or had had a heated exchange with the local Country Party member, hardly anyone would have known about it. Curtin might have made some phone calls in the town, but for much of the slow journey to the nation's capital, he would have been incommunicado. Curtin would have been amazed, incidentally, at the sleek VIP planes that modern Prime Ministers jet about in, but he wouldn't probably have been envious because he hated flying. He'd certainly be very curious about some of the issues in today's politics. For example, the intense debate about the environment. Climate change as a great moral challenge of our time would be an eye-opener to him. And he'd be gobsmacked that one of the main debates at the last national conference of the ALP was the party's position on gay marriage. He'd be interested that the Rudd government tackled the global financial crisis with traditional Keynesian policies. He was one of the very big fans of Keynes. But he might say, when the Labor figures talked about this as the greatest crisis since the Great Depression, well, yes, but the Depression was just so much worse for the ordinary people who were our constituency. He'd note how not even those on the left of today's party mentioned the socialism anymore, or the socialist objective. That the party had become, albeit with some qualifications, a devotee of the market, and that far from wanting to nationalise anything, like Chiff's dream about the banks, Labor had, in the Hawke-Keating days, got the privatisation ball rolling. A great reader, he would have already have bought a copy of Chris Bowen's Hearts and Minds, a blueprint for modern Labor, and noted Bowen's blunt statement that Labor's official socialist objective gives no guidance as to Labor's practical governing philosophy. With Bowen among those modern Labor luminaries walking the Cottesloe Beach, the two might have a vigorous discussion about the Shadow Treasurer's advice, it's time to scrap the socialist objective and have a clear, concise and modern explanation of Labor's governing philosophy. And what would he think of Bowen's observation that promoting the use of market forces to drive economic growth and using the national wealth created by economic growth to drive greater opportunities for people from all walks of life is Labor at its best. And we need to be much more upfront about this than we have been, Bowen said. Curtin would find much of the modern Labor Party unrecognisable. But, being a pragmatist as well as an idealist, he would no doubt rethink many of his old positions in light of modern circumstances. And he would turn his mind to giving some sound advice on coping with the exigencies of opposition. Curtin, who became leader by one vote in 1935 and led Labor out of the wilderness and into minority government in 1941 and election victory in 1943, was a party unifier and builder. He was a plain man who could crystallise his messages. In these days, it was via compelling oratory, not the brief 30-second grab, and he connected with the public. Now, in another century and other circumstances, Labor and its leaders face a rebuilding job. A job that is challenging, but, let's face it, is much, much easier than that faced by Curtin. Leaving the days of Curtin, it is worth comparing the situation of Labor now with the two most recent experiences of defeat, which also requires comparison of the three preceding periods of government. After Gough Whitlam's dismissal and subsequent election loss, Labor was left with a record of poor economic management, the the image of bad administrators and the taint of scandal from the loans affair. Labor had had only a brief period in office after 23 years in opposition. So the failures of that government made a very deep impression on the voters. The ALP had in particular to convince the public that it had learned about the economy if it was to rebuild any sort of electoral faith. The public would not revisit Whitlam. 1977 was another landslide. But by 1980 there was a swing to Labor and, of course, victory at the following election. The Keating 1996 loss was more a case of Labor in office since 1983 having worn out its welcome and Keating himself having lost focus and community support. The subsequent opposition period was difficult because Labor was not sure how much to own the Hawke-Keating period of economic transformation. It was reluctant initially to claim the reforms, perhaps because it failed to see that they could be distinguished and their success could be distinguished from the later personal unpopularity of Keating and problems of his government. While these Labor governments were very unpopular at the time of their defeats, their legacies have been substantial and increasingly recognised as the years have gone by. Whitlam's initiatives in education, health, even though Medibank was scrapped, it came back, of course, as Medicare, the environment, law reform and much else were transformational. The reform period of the Hawke-Keating years in opening up the Australian economy now wins praise across the political spectrum. Labor in each of these periods did more of lasting substance, I think, than it achieved in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. Leaving aside the important and symbolic apology to Indigenous people, the biggest single achievement of Labor in this last period was getting Australia through the global financial crisis without it falling into recession. Now, this, of course, should not be underestimated. It was in obvious sharp contrast, not just to much of the experience overseas, but with the experience of the Scullin government, in which Curtin was a backbencher, and indeed with the experience of the Whitlam government's handling of the international oil shock. But it was a negative achievement rather than a positive legacy, saving the house from a fire rather than building or renovating a house. And because of program glitches and the voters' inclination to downplay preventing disasters or downplay something avoided, Labor never reaped the full credit that it should have from that achievement. Now, one could point to the carbon price as an achievement, but that will not be lasting in the immediate term, and there must be some doubt whether it could become a repeat of the Medibank Medicare story. If Rudd had been better as a negotiator, it is conceivable, and I admit this is a somewhat long bow, but it is conceivable that he might have got the carbon price through the Parliament so that it would have been embedded earlier and would have been harder for a later government to dismantle. The Rudd government had a tax inquiry, but the big thing that came out of that inquiry was the mining tax, and that whole experience, of course, was botched. Starting the NBN will be a legacy, but the rollout was slow, and by 2013 the program was still partial enough to allow the Conservative government to take it in a less comprehensive direction. The Gillard government produced the Gonski Blueprint for Schools funding, but in that case it left it all too late and again failed to get it into place, and although Tony Abbott has partially taken it over, the extent to which it will be implemented will be limited, and that's becoming more clear as time goes on. Julia Gillard started the progress towards a national disability scheme, but the work is still in its infancy. Let's just glance back for a moment and contrast Curtin's use of his time. The Rudd and Gillard governments between them were in power for a combination of 6 years. Half of it was the hung parliament. Curtin was in office for less than 4 years, and about half of his time was also a hung parliament. Apart from running the war effort, during his administration, Curtin put in place measures and work that shaped post-war Australia, including, most importantly, the introduction of uniform taxation, which made possible the expansion of social welfare and much else. Now, in being impressed with how much Curtin got done, one qualification should be made. It was wartime, and while that produced, of course, its own difficulties, let alone the huge distraction of having to manage the war effort, distraction from other issues that he could pursue, it also enabled him to get additional powers, and it did reduce to some extent the opposition to other measures that would have come if it was a more normal situation. Of the three modern Labor eras, it was the Rudd-Gillard period when Labor squandered power, and it did so mostly by its own hand because of leadership flaws and the failure of cabinet ministers and the caucus to speak up when they needed to do so. The Hawke-Keating period, of course, had its leadership problems and saw Hawke eventually brought down by Keating. But that decision was later on, and the process more understandable to the party and to the public. While parties will often have to cope with leadership tensions and battles, Labor in the last few years let them consume its governments. Yet out of the destruction has come a big and radical step forward in party democracy, a new method of choosing the leader. The rank and file now has 50% of the vote. One of the tasks in opposition will be tidying up this new leadership election process, and that will be done at the 2015 National Conference. There's no way the power will go back to the caucus alone, but there could be a push to give the unions also a say in the process, which I think would not be a good idea, given that many voters feel that the party is too tied to the unions, too dominated by the unions. And there may be some questioning of the thresholds to trigger a spill. Currently they're 75% for a Labor Prime Minister and 60% for an opposition leader. Dealing the grassroots into selecting the leader reflects what happens in many parties overseas. The new system certainly cushioned the ALP in the immediate aftermath of this year's defeat. The party gained new members, and the leadership contest absorbed interest and prevented what would normally be a fair bit of post-election bloodletting. The ballot between Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese was a downbeat, respectful contest, a restrained, managed battle, in dramatic contrast to the years of leadership backstabbing that had preceded it. Does this dose of democracy have any potential downsides for the party? Some would argue that giving a say to the rank and file, who tend to lean further left than the caucus, could result in a leader who is less representative of the community. But I think we saw in the recent ballot a sort of adjustment factor at work. The caucus part of the vote didn't follow strict factional lines. Shorten received a bigger vote than just his own right faction. He received some of the left vote. Another more serious issue is whether this system builds in too much rigidity. For example, should a leader who is performing badly have as much protection as these rules give? Has the party, reacting against the rotisserie of leadership, gone too far the other way? And there is one very practical complication. If a leader did fall over mid-term, the month-long election process could be very difficult. It worked all right after the election, when there was a sort of natural break, but 2 years into a 3-year term, for example, it would be quite another thing. That would put on pressure to avoid a contest by having only one candidate, thus defeating the whole object of the democratic system. More broadly, the period in opposition will see a push to further democracy in the party, but whether this will come to much is quite another question. One notable feature of the post-election period is that the factions have been as powerful as ever, regardless of the greater democracy in the structure. And that's both the leadership and the caucus getting back the right to choose the front bench. This factional resilience was especially clear in the ballot for the front bench, which was all neatly tied up at a factional level before people went into the caucus meeting. Although the leadership ballot produced something of a mini surge in membership, I think Labor will continue to face difficulties getting people to join. There is just not that much interest these days in people joining parties, even aside from the deterrent provided by factionalism. Mark Latham, in his book, characterises the party's present situation in this description. The grand old party of working class participation has become a virtual party, top-heavy with union factional bosses. A way that has been canvassed to get more people involved is through a system of primaries which are being trialled. This brings in registered supporters rather than just party members when MPs when future MPs candidates are being chosen. I must say I would have some concerns about the potential for branch stacking and for rorting, or for stacking not branches but stacking the supporters' ranks and rorting, but still I think it's worth the experiment. One thing Labor certainly needs to do, by whatever means, is attract a wider range of strong candidates and candidates from more diverse backgrounds. Although it has quite a talent pool even in its reduced ranks, and Rudd's saving of some seats helped this, it should aim for top of the range and diverse candidates in 2016. In opposition, Labor has to show that it can manage itself, and the trauma of recent years will in fact help it there. It knows the consequences of failing to do so. But maintaining unity can't be carried to a point where it stifles internal party debate. Because Labor's big challenge is defining what it stands for and convincing the public of the worth of its policies. This is more complex than when Curtin was opposition leader. In those days, the parties were more sharply defined. Rebuilding after the Rudd-Gillard era requires Labor to acquire again credentials on economic management, which, let's face it, it should never have forfeited, given it handled the financial crisis very well, or at least handled the fundamentals well, but had problems with the implementation of programs. It must convince voters that a new Labor government would manage administration competently. In positioning itself, Labor has the usual challenge of a base that's split between the battlers, broadly defined, and middle-class progressives. But it faces not just the traditional electoral battle with the right, but also the threat from the Greens on the left, although the September vote does suggest that the Greens may have peaked. It has the further complication that its main base spreads from aspirational voters to what Mark Latham calls the underclass of people having to survive on welfare. The carbon pricing issue highlights the problem of juggling the various constituencies. The party is sticking to its election policy, support for an emissions trading system, at the moment. But once the tax is repealed, as it almost certainly will be by the new Senate in the middle of next year, and apparently there's today a July sitting scheduled for that Senate to get things through as quickly as possible, and assuming global warming doesn't revive as a huge issue of community concern, just how difficult will it be for Labor to, in 2016, go to the polls proposing a new impost? The progressive part of the base would support it, but the battlers are another matter. With money tight, it is difficult for Labor to carve out new areas that will catch the imagination of the electorate. In making Shorten leader, the party has chosen on the basis of potential rather than experience, capacity for ideas rather than combat readiness in the Parliament. Shorten's natural pitch is more consensus than confrontation, and there is a touch of the Bob Hawke approach about him. He often describes himself as a negotiator. If he can build on this, it is an approach that could have appeal to an electorate that is jaded and sick of all the shouting. Shorten is looking to tap into particular constituencies, especially the female vote, where he thinks Abbott is vulnerable. He also wants to make Labor competitive among small businesses. One of his early efforts certainly needs to be to regain some Labor credibility with bigger businesses. This will be among his hardest tasks. Business was relieved to see the change of government and has been given a special in with the new Abbott administration. The head of the Business Council, Tony Shepherd, chairs the Commission of Audit, a very powerful position. Now, Shorten can't win over the big end of town, but he will need to blunt its ill feelings about Labor, which built up quite strongly in the latter period. Shorten has shown he can identify and push good ideas. His seizing on and promotion of a disability insurance scheme when he was Parliamentary Secretary highlighted an ability to understand needs and opportunities. In updating its agenda, Labor doesn't necessarily have to toss overboard all that it was doing before. Just as Abbott refreshed rather than replaced his 2010 agenda for the 2013 campaign. Labor's problem in those years, I think, was not so much what it proposed and promoted, but that it failed in execution and explanation. But it will need to review and update, to drop some things and to add some fresh policy to its toolkit. Labor cannot rely on the Abbott government handing the sort of electoral gold to its opponents that Labor did for its opponents. Although given the way today's politics and the news cycle operate, there is likely to be reasonable ammunition. Today's Nielsen poll, while it may be only a flash in the pan, which shows Labor actually ahead on a two-party vote, reminds us that Labor could become a competitive force again reasonably quickly. But that will require the ALP to handle itself very well and the government to run into considerable problems. And of course and fundamentally, it will require leadership of high quality in the best of Labor's tradition. The leadership has to be all about trust. The leader winning the trust of the front bench, the trust of the caucus, and the trust of the community. Curtin historian David Black says that ultimately, and I quote, John Curtin's greatest ally and strength was trust. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.